Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and welcome to the British School at Rome. It's a very great pleasure to see you all here this evening for our third David Whitehouse Memorial Lecture. Before introducing our speaker, Bill Gudenrath, I'll say a few words about David Whitehouse. David died on 17th February 2013, aged 71. He was a tremendously important figure in the history of the British School at Rome and in the history of his respective fields of study, which include but are not entirely encompassed by glass and medieval ceramics. He's best known, perhaps, for his excavations at the ancient city port of Siraf in the Persian Gulf, as well as for his studies on Roman, medieval and Islamic glass as director of the Corning Museum. But he was at the centre of the birth of medieval archaeology as a discipline in Italy, and during his directorship from 1974 to 1984, the British School at Rome maintained the major role in Italian medieval archaeology that had begun under Ward Perkins but was taken so much further by David. He first specialised in early medieval and medieval Italian ceramics. His research there was truly groundbreaking. He not only managed to create typologies and series which have stood the test of time, but he also tested them in many archaeological investigations across Italy. And these excavations, which focused on the elusive transition period between late antiquity and the Middle Ages, really were the basis of the flourishing of medieval archaeology that happened in those years and was carried on by another director of the British School at Rome, Richard Hodges. David was appointed Wainwright Fellow in Near Eastern Archaeology in 1966 at the University of Oxford, and he remained there until 1973. He directed 6 seasons of excavation at Siraf in the Persian Gulf, most of which had been destroyed by an earthquake around 970. This was the first systematic excavation of an Islamic urban site, and among the most important undertaken on a major early centre in the Eastern Islamic world. Subsequently, he spent a year as director of the British Institute of Afghan Studies in Kandahar. We no longer have the British Institute of Afghan Studies in Kandahar, unfortunately. It's said that when David set off from Oxford to Kandahar, he told all his colleagues, if you're passing by, do stop and say hello. Anyway. After that, he was appointed in 1974 as director of the British School at Rome, where he remained for 10 very important years. He extended his ceramic studies to the area of Lazio with the publication of 2 major articles, the Synthesis of Early Medieval Ceramics of Rome in 1978, and the first reliable early medieval and medieval ceramic typology for Latium in 1982, not only of distinctive glazed forum ware, but also of more common domestic wares. And this was all fundamental, and it was accompanied by, as I said, vigorous archaeological excavation. And here is David at Fafa with a team. And I can't refrain to point out that amongst the team, and those of you with good eyes will be able to spot, is our own registrar, Jill Clark. There you are. I'll give you that one to have a good look at. Now, of course, as director, David also was the front face of the British School at Rome. And here we have what is rather a poignant and remarkable photo for us. This is 1976, and David Whitehouse welcoming Her Royal Highness Princess Alexandra on what I believe was her first visit to the British School at Rome as President of the Council. Just last month, Princess Alexandra returned to the British School at Rome 40 years on to unveil the donor board, which you can see in the foyer. It's a rather lovely photograph, which I hope we'll have the opportunity to present to Her Royal Highness in due course. In 1984, David left Rome to join the Corning Museum of Glass in New York, first as chief curator, then as deputy director, and from 1992 to 2011 as his director. He stood down in 2011 to focus on his research, becoming the museum's senior scholar, and during this period entered into a new field of studies, that of ancient Islamic medieval glass. Just as his contribution to medieval ceramics had been fundamental, so his contribution to Italian medieval, ancient Islamic medieval glass was fundamental. During his editorship, the Journal of Glass Studies became the standard international journal for the discipline. He published a series of major catalogues of the museum's unique glass collection and restructured the museum. David was, I think, beloved by everybody who knew him, both here and at the Corning Museum. I'm so pleased that Carol White, who's currently the director of the Corning Museum, can be with us again. Carol was our first David Whitehouse Memorial Lecturer, so it's brilliant to have you back. And it was Carol who suggested that fitting person for our third lecture would be Bill Gudenrath. And I've no doubt that was an exceptionally good recommendation. We're thrilled that Bill can be with us. William Gudenrath is a glassblower, a scholar, an author, a lecturer, and a teacher. He is recognized internationally as one of the foremost authorities on glassmaking techniques from the ancient world right through to the 18th century. In 1989, he developed a widely accepted theory regarding the original form and the probable method of manufacture of the world's most celebrated ancient glass object, the Portland vase. Despite a detour in 1974 to earn a bachelor's degree from the University of North Texas and a Master of Music degree from Juilliard School in 1978, most of Bill Gudenrath's life has been dedicated to the material he says he fell in love with at the age of 11 with a chemistry set that served as his first introduction to glass and glassworking. I hope you didn't blow the house up. In addition to his numerous contributions in print and video on many aspects of glass history, Bill Gudenrath is co-chairman with Lino Tagliapietra of the Technical Committee of Venetian Glass Study Days at the Istituto Veneto di Scienze, Lettere ed Arte in Venice, as well as being, of course, a fellow of the Corning Museum of Glass. His most recent project, which I've circulated to all of our residents here, the museum's first electronic publication of techniques of Renaissance Venetian glassworking, is a tour de force of the combination of immense technical skill and knowledge with the joys of modern technology, and is a truly fitting place for which to stop and pass over to Bill Gudenrath. We look forward enormously to hearing your lecture, which I'm sure will be a very fitting memorial to the work of David Whitehouse. Thank you very much indeed.
Good evening. It's true, I did start at 11, and I'm still madly in love with glass. And tonight I'm going to speak to you and show you videos and slides about the process of glass blowing. And glass blowing is a latecomer in the history of glass technology, in that when glass blowing came around, sometime in the middle of the 1st century BC, there was a long history of forming glass by casting and other processes. When glass blowing came along and spread throughout the Roman world, it largely, by, say, the later 1st century, it largely displaced other techniques. So it's a fundamentally important change in technology. And what I'm going to speak to you tonight about are two great moments in that technology. One is glass blowing in the Roman world, its ascent and its high point of virtuosity in the 4th century. And the other is Venice. The other place and time is Venice in the Renaissance and the Baroque. And during that time, glass blowing went beyond its high points in the Roman world and attained a degree of virtuosity which hasn't been exceeded. And I think at the end of the evening, having watched a few videos of the processes, you may, I hope, have a deeper understanding of the process of glass blowing. And it's not like anything we encounter in our everyday lives growing up as kids. We all draw, we all paint, we all play with clay and sculpt. Sometimes we whittle wood. There are various things we encounter, but it's virtually never hot glass. So it's exotic, and it remains exotic. And when I started as a kid, nobody ever had met a glassblower. Today, it's not so uncommon because of the studio glass movement, largely. There are basically two ways to shape a piece of glass. One is cold working, and the other is hot working. And cold working is basically a lapidary process to the material, whereby glass is ground away or chipped away or grozzed away with pincers, and then it's polished, it's ground and polished. Cold working for glass is exactly like lapidary processes for hard stones. The other way of shaping a piece of glass is by one of the hot working techniques. And hot working can include casting. You can cast glass just like you can cast bronze and iron. There are a number of glass-specific processes before glass blowing. I'll show you one of those. And then glass blowing comes along. And that's what we're going to focus on. I said that glass blowing begins roughly in the middle of the 1st century BC. That's our thought now. Our best evidence for that are these finds from Jerusalem, from an excavation in about 1971-72, in which were discovered these blue tubes. They were found in a mikveh, a ritual bath, in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. And they consist of blue tubes. These are broken, but at the end of the tubes were these bubbles. And someone made blue tubing, heated one end until it closed, and then blew in the other end. And these are the earliest closely datable glass artifacts. Now, when these were first published, they were dated something like 60 to 50 BC. Now it's looking more like 50 to 40 BC. At any rate, we don't have anything earlier with a hard date. If you notice, the one GL29, and 20 and 30, they have teeny holes at their tips. And here's the first of the videos where I show you my reconstruction of the process by which these things were made. And Pepe, the video is not opening. I'll click again and see if that does it. There it is. There are a number of ways to make glass tubing without glass blowing. This is one of them. Egyptians made glass tubing 1,500 years before glass blowing came along. And this is a gather of glass on the end of a metal rod. I've increased the diameter at the edge, and now I'm pulling, and you can see the tubing being drawn from this reservoir area. As glass cools, it gradually hardens. The cold pincers, together with a little mechanical shock, cleanly break the tubing. Next, the end has to be heated. And it's kind of difficult to see that in a furnace, so we redid the video with a modern burner. At any rate, watch carefully, please, as the end of the tube gets hot. The glass softens, surface tension causes the glass to try to occupy less volume, and it effectively closes the tip of the tube. And the last inch or so of the tube is hot. So when I blow, there it is. Ironically, this is exactly how I began glass blowing in 1962 when I was 11 years old. If you watch the end, here is the GL29 and 30. If you watch, the end doesn't completely close. It's still small enough to develop the pressure. And there's the end. Well, let's call it middle of the 1st century BC. And now we're going to look at some various different pieces with fairly closely datable contexts, and look at some other glassblowing technologies from the beginning of glassblowing. In that mikveh were also found these simple vessels. from perhaps 30-ish to 20-ish BC. On the far left, we have a bottle found in a cave in the Judean desert near the town of En-Gedi. It's datable variously to 40-ish, as late as early as 40-ish BC. Some now say 20-ish BC. Anyway, it's from a good find. It's a good find with a fairly close date if it can just be finalized. It's early inflated glass. There are parallels. This is one in the Corning Museum of Glass. This is one in Croatia, the Custodia in Paris. And I'd like to show you my reconstruction of the process. And there's a big change that happens here. You'll see that I gather the glass on the end of a metal tube, a blowpipe. There's the glass. It's at about 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's roughly the consistency of honey at room temperature. There's the bubble. The pipe is held downward to thin the area near the blowpipe. And the simple two-bladed tools called the jacks that have certainly been around since the medieval period, maybe the Roman period. At any rate, this simple tool is used to divide the bubble into two sections. The upper part becomes the neck, the lower part becomes the vessel body. I'm holding it down so that gravity will exert its force near the blowpipe. There's some spin for centripetal force to further elongate the neck. And here is the tooling which produces the characteristic scarring right around the transition between the tube and the vessel body. The bottom is heated and flattened. And then the next part is the rim. The rim has to be finished. So it's broken off the blowpipe, held with some sort of a clamp-like device, and the mouth is heated at the opening of the furnace and is given its final shape. So that, I believe, is approximately the process used for the En-Gedi bottle. Now, moving to the west from Cosa, from the Palatine Hill, from various areas on the Italian peninsula, we have finds that David Gross dated to the late 1st century BC, possibly the early 1st century AD. And you'll see the similarity. They have the constriction, the scarring at the neck. They have the tubular neck with the bulbous vessel body, their furnace-finished rims. They're pretty much what we saw going on, presumably, in Israel. Here's a very interesting group of objects from the Italian peninsula, said to be from the early 1st century AD, often called ribbon bottles, sometimes color band bottles. And they're really interesting because they combine an old technology with the then new technology of glassblowing. And the old technology is fusing. The first stage of this process was to fuse strips of glass together, then put them on a blowpipe and blow the vessel. The fusing part had been around since Greek and Hellenistic times, and I'd like to show you approximately how that's done. This is a typical fused slumped bowl, Roman, late 1st century BC, 1st century AD. These were made in huge numbers. And here's I'm sorry this is so white, but this is the process. In the case of this bowl, there's the finished bowl. The canes are cane slices. This is a cane being drawn. It's being cut into slices about 1/4 inch long. They're placed on a ceramic plate and heated. They soften. They can be squished together. A previously formed edge cane is heated and then wrapped around the perimeter. It's reheated and flattened and made perfectly smooth. And that's the fusing process. Now, in this case, it's followed immediately by the slumping or draping process. And you can't see it very well, but there's a ceramic hemispherical form right there. And the hot, soft disc is being placed on top. And in the furnace, you see gravity begin to shape it. That's often called slumping, sometimes draping. it's further manipulated. The bowl is taken off and then ground and polished. That, as I said before, was being practiced in the third and fourth centuries BC. So it's not a new technology, but connecting it with glass blowing is a very interesting choice on the part of the glass blowers. The first part is to make the colored glass strips. And it's very common in the ancient world to make the colored glass transparent and overlay it atop opaque white glass. And if you look at the ends, you'll see just that. It makes the color very beautiful because the light passes through the amber glass, bounces off the white, comes back through the amber, and you get a beautiful depth. The canes have been stuck together, fused. They're being attached to the end of a metal rod. And one of the characteristics of the ribbon bottles is that there's a beautiful fold. There's the fold. And though the canes are fused together, they retain their integrity in terms of color. This is forming, beginning to make it round. It's going to be attached to a blowpipe, so it has to be round. And in the foreground, there's the blowpipe. Here's the little fused plug. It's transferred to the blowpipe. That's the new part. That's the application of the new technology. And with a lot of kind of boring reheatings between, the inflation takes place, and the parts that I don't want to blow out are rubbed against this cold metal table to keep them from inflating. And now you can see it's just like the glass blowing you saw before, just like the Anghetti bottle. The process is identical. Again, a very simple, basic glass blowing process. And similarly, it's held with a clamp. These typically have a folded edge, that little conical device pushed the edge inward. I'll create the final shape of the flare. And if you look, you can see the edge. That's a folded rim. Very common in first century Roman glass. So those are ribbon bottles. And again, this is a survey through various sources of information about early glass blowing, various early objects, and in this case, iconographic evidence. And this is in the form of Pompeian wall paintings. And the dating of those has undergone a lot of scrutiny the last 20 or 30 years. Originally, people dated them in the middle of the first century BC. People now are thinking they're more in the early first century AD. At any rate, they show clearly to me blown glass vessels. They have what we call a folded rim, kind of like what you just saw, except here the fold is external. The edge winds up on the outside of the vessel, and they have the characteristic foot that we sometimes call a Roman foot or an integral foot. And we join, these are two objects in the Corning Museum of Glass collection that have those features, the outer folds and the Roman feet. So we join the glass blowing pretty far along. This is the making of the Roman foot. There's the constriction. While holding it, I suck in with the rubber tube. This is refining the shape. In this case, the vessel is held with a punty or a pontal. And here's the outer fold. And the outer fold is actually very tricky. You can see it beginning to go awry there. It's easy to fix, but it's a tricky maneuver. The Roman foot is actually a very difficult maneuver. And the glass is reheated, shaped, reheated, shaped. The glass is thin and it cools very quickly. So off screen, off camera, there's a lot of reheating in these processes. In real time, a bowl like that takes about 8 or 9 minutes to make. And the last early glass blowing process that I'm going to show you is the one that I associate with the famous Cameo objects, the most famous being, of course, the Portland vase in the British Museum, the Aljo jug in the British Museum, the Naples vase that is in the National Museum in Naples, and so forth. I'm going to show you a video in a moment of my reconstruction of the process of making a blank for these. And I say blank because the glass blowers made a blank that was, after it was cooled, was passed on to lapidary workers who cut away white glass to create the decoration, just as it was done with hard stone. As we're doing this, I urge you to notice that all of the vessels have a bare blue neck. And you can see it very clearly here. The handle sits atop bare blue glass here. It sits atop white glass here. Same thing there, same thing there. And let's look at that process. And it begins with blue glass being gathered onto the end of a blowpipe. After it cools a bit, it's formed to shape a tube. And when it's cool enough to hold its shape, it's lowered partway into a pot of molten opaque white glass. And you'll notice that the uppermost part is bare blue glass. So with some blowing and tooling, the white glass reheats the blue glass. They're inflated together. It's transferred to a punty or pontil so that the rim can be formed. And when the rim softens, a simple tool is used to flare it. And there's the blank. It's cooled over a period of hours and then passed on to lapidary workers. And as I said before, the uppermost part is always bare blue glass, with the white glass available for decoration always in the lower half or so of the vessel. I mentioned that the lapidary work is identical to that carried out for cutting hard stones. This is the Tazza Farnese in Naples. Exact same process. That's cold working. And the interesting thing to me, and this didn't occur to me until a few years ago, again and again what you see is a tubular neck, a bulbous vessel body. Even in vessels that don't, as a finished product, have that, you'll remember perhaps that in the making of this, there was once the tubular neck. Here's the Morgan cup in the Corning Museum of Glass. It doesn't have the tubular neck, but it's my suspicion that this was originally something like the Getty bottle, cut off at a certain point. So I suspect it had a tubular neck. And the reason I think they all had this is essential to the early glass blowing process. It's unavoidable. It's essential to have a tubular neck because that's the way the hardened but still very hot glass is separated from the blowpipe. And for me, that's the number one technological feat in early glass blowing. It's getting the glass off the blowpipe. So someone came up with this very clever method, this very clever approach of making a tube. And as you may remember from making the tubing, remember I said that with the cold pincers, I held the hot tubing and tapped it, and it broke cleanly. Glass tubing, up to the diameter of about 3/4 of an inch, if it's hot, can break very cleanly. So somebody figured that out, and when they did, it opened up the door for all of this. Are there any questions about that? We're going to move on to Venice shortly. Is there anything that you didn't understand about the processes and you'd like to ask at this point? Yes? The oldest blowpipe I've encountered was in the research laboratory of the British Museum. It's dated to about 125 AD. It's quite late compared to what we've been looking at, and it was made of iron. And it seems to have had a hammer-welded seam, and the head was solid with a hole drilled through it, perhaps. There's no evidence for earlier tools that I know of, but that's the oldest blowpipe, and it was iron. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
First principles, the glass itself. I mean, how was that discovered?
We don't know. The question is, how was glass discovered? That is absolutely lost in the sands of time, as they say, an appropriate term, because of course glass is largely made of sand. Anyway, I was one of the authors of the book 5,000 Years of Glass, published by British Museum Press back in 1989-90. And I don't think any of us believed that there were really 5,000 years of glass. I don't think it goes quite that far back. But whether it was made in association with the glazing of ceramics, and it was noticed and discovered, so to speak, to be a potentially autonomous material, I think no one knows. There are various theories, that being one of them, but no one really knows about the origins of glass. The earliest closely datable glass object that I know happens to be in the British Museum, and I think the date is something like 16 to 1500 BC, Mesopotamian, I think from Ur, however you pronounce that. And we have glass in many different areas at different times. Whether it was discovered multiple times, we don't know. So that's a question no one can answer. Glass blowing, I think I probably can tell you about as much as anyone about the early glass blowing process. But early glass making, it's lots of question marks. Please.
You showed two methods of finishing, sort of a lamp-like tool.
Right.
Doesn't survive from antiquity, and then you showed the punty. What's the earliest? When does the punty begin to be used as that tool?
You know, the question is, you saw two ways of holding the hot vessel to finish the rim. One was with a clamp, and the other was a little bit of hot glass on the end of a metal rod. Both are handles. They're both different kinds of handles. The question was, when do we have the first punties? And my answer to that question is, I don't know, but my evidence is based on these objects. If these were made as early as 30 to 20 BC, even if they were as late as 30 to 40 AD, they're still very early. I think they're blown glass. There is some controversy as to whether or not they're blown, but no one has proved the other theories even remotely to my satisfaction, such that those methods replicate the features we see in the original objects. Anyway, the rim of the Portland vase and the blue vase and the Aljo jug, they were all formed at the furnace, just like you saw me do the little Getty scent bottle. They were held from the bottom somehow while the rim was heated and finished, and then while the handles were attached. So there's no question that these had to have been held from the bottom for the completion of the upper part of the vessels. The problem is, even with about a third of the Portland vase missing, maybe a quarter missing, the Naples vase is large and heavy. The Aljo jug is also big and heavy. I don't think those could be held with a clamp. The only way I can envision, and the only way in making replicas of these things I can do it, is with the metal glass-tipped punty or pontil. Those terms are interchangeable, by the way. So I think, to my satisfaction, I would say that these pieces are associated with the punty or pontil. Unfortunately, we don't have any evidence of that because the lower part of this vessel is missing. The lower part of this vessel has been cold worked entirely, ground and polished. This has been ground and polished. So is this. So there's no physical evidence. The evidence has been ground away. So there's no pontil mark there. But just based on the weight of the object, I don't think they could be held in a clamp. So that's my answer to the question, how early did the punty come into play? So, okay. Any other questions? Ground away. We spoke of lapidary processes whereby a piece of stone like this can be ground by pushing it against a rotating stone wheel. to grind away material to create the form and decoration. That's cold working, or it's a lapidary process, whatever you want to call it. Those processes were long in place when all of these objects were made. And so the bottom of this vessel has been ground and polished with a rather beautiful series of concentric circles. The bottom of the Getty scent bottle has a very interesting leaf pattern, as does the Morgan cup. So they were putting decoration down there. So the physical evidence of a scar from the punty has been ground away. That's what I mean. Yes? It's okay.
Can you tell us a bit more about the pigments?
Pigments.
Where you get the wonderful blue from, or the red? Where would that have, what would have been added to create?
Where did we see red?
Earlier when
Okay. Well, anyway, the glass making technology is very old, is very controlled at this point. The blue, say, for example, these. The blue is a lot of cobalt oxide and a little bit of iron added to the glass, a little iron oxide. The combination produces the blue, the characteristic blue. The white is tin oxide and lead oxide. A lot of it dissolves in the glass, and that makes a very opaque white glass. Lead was also added to this white glass. It's thought to, it's always published as because it makes it easier to cut. In fact, I think it made it easier to make the white glass compatible with the blue glass, but that's a technicality. At any rate, by this time, late 1st century BC or late 1st century AD, whichever you choose, the glass making technology was fully in place. If you think of that, yes, the multicolored ribbon bottles and the ribbon bowl that I showed you, all of those colors have to be compatible. So the glassmaker not only has to make the right color to the right intensity, but it also has to be physically compatible with the other colors, so that when it cools, they all lose volume at about the same rate and to about the same degree. Because if they aren't matched that way as they cool, they'll crack apart. The colors with the higher coefficient of expansion will shrink away from the lower coefficient of expansion glasses, and they'll break apart. So that technology, which is way harder than you might suspect, way trickier than you might suspect, that technology was very much in place at this point. That's what you meant by pigments? Okay, right. Yes?
Do you know of any accidents occurring during the grinding, polishing?
Huh.
And the glue bars underneath breaking up?
I don't. Of the grinding and polishing, I don't happen to know. Well, there is, Carol, isn't there one unfinished cage cup or a blank that's partially finished? So cage cups are from the 4th century. They're a lot later than this. But that's an example of cold working abandoned or gone wrong.
But you might comment, Bill, on the fact that as you're encasing the blue with the white, there's always the risk of trapping an air bubble. So as the engraver is parting away the white,
That's true.
you might encounter that. And I've seen evidence on the cameos where I suspect that the decoration was deliberately placed to avoid a spot where an air bubble was evident between the two colors so that it would create an accident when it was being grown.
Exactly. That overlay process you saw in the Portland vase, for example, on one side there's an entire patch of bubbles that occurred, and they're between the blue and the white glass. And it's clear to me that when they overlaid this with the white glass, the blowpipe was held at an angle and was not being turned. They submerged it, and the top side trapped a lot of air bubbles. Then they began to turn. And you see that patch. It starts at the bottom, and it runs about like that, about that high. And you don't find bubbles up here because, of course, there's no overlay. Okay, so let's go on to Venice. Before we do that, I thought this has all been like eating the meat and potatoes. Let me give you a little bit of dessert and show you the creativity that goes into these things. Of course, there's the question of the form. the glassblower has a huge variety of forms at hand, but many of the vessels have handles. And so I want to show you, there's a whole world of handles in Roman glass. Many different types, many different shapes. Here's a particularly beautiful Skyphos handle from Altino, not too far from Venice. The basic process goes thusly. Here's the finished vessel, and on the end of a metal rod is a gather of glass, fresh and hot from the furnace. That's the primary attachment point now. Here's the second attachment point. And I think by the time these videos are over and we end this, you'll have a pretty good idea of how long glass stays soft. Here it is again. That happens very quickly. One of the most interesting things about Roman handles is they don't have shear marks. Here are the shears. There's a shear mark. Romans didn't accept that for whatever reason. And after the second attachment point, they always cast off the excess glass, thus avoiding a shear mark that might be sharp and unpleasant to look at and unpleasant to touch. The casting off process for handles is very tricky, and I don't see it in 19th century replicas. Here's another handle, and here's the primary attachment point, the second attachment point. The cast-off thread goes over the top, and there's the end of it. All of these handles have a cast-off thread. Sometimes they're easy to see, sometimes they're hard to see. Most Roman handles are flat. And the reason they're flat is because, I think, because they lose heat more quickly. In the cooling process, they lose the heat faster, and it's less likely to crack. So there's a flattened handle. This is a characteristic feature called a thumb rest. There's the thumb rest being made. Now, we go off screen because every 10 seconds or so, this has to be returned to the furnace to keep the vessel above about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. If it goes below 1,000 or so, the vessel will begin to crack down here. Now, certainly the most interesting and virtuosic handle is the double handle. This is a very interesting process whereby a gather of glass is flattened, divided in two, in this case it's attached to a mold-blown vessel. And I'll show you that again from the front. A handle like this, it's tempting to say it's showing off. There's a lot of playfulness in handles in Roman glass. A lot of creativity, and I think a lot of playfulness, and I think a lot of virtuosity for virtuosity's sake. Difficult for difficult's sake. And nowhere does that get more out of hand than in the 4th century environs of present-day Cologne. This is a vessel that has two kinds of decoration on it. It has what we call snake thread decoration, and it has little flame-worked decorations. Here's one that's better in focus. There's the snake thread, and there's the lamp-worked or flame-worked decoration. And I think I know everyone out there working in the Roman style, and I don't know anyone who can begin to do this well. I don't actually know anyone who can do it, much less do it well. So it's a very advanced technique, virtuosity for virtuosity's sake. From the same place and time, the environs of Cologne and 4th century, we have what's often called the masterpiece. And it's a flask, a pilgrim flask, with these 4 holes, and inside the holes are placed these sort of crude but sincerely placed birds. And this is just playfulness, virtuosity, creativity. Again, I know only one person who can approximate this, a fellow in England, as a matter of fact, a glassblower named Mark Taylor, who operates in Andover. And he has come close to this a couple of times. In the 19th century, when there was a German company making replicas of Roman glass in Cologne, they came nowhere near this or this. They did very poor snake thread, and they never even tried the flame working. It's actually way beyond, I think, the capability of anyone since. So for me, that's a real high point in glass working and glass technology, hand making of glass objects. 4th century Cologne. So we'll move to Venice, and Venice is going to be a little bit briefer story. And we begin with just the mention that Venice is, of course, a 5th century city. Didn't exist in Roman times. And glassblowing, the closest glassblowing to Venice in the Roman period was up on the mainland, about up here in a town called Altino. You know that Venice was formed in the 400s. Venice was founded in the 400s. And we have glassblowing also in Aquileia, considerably to the east, and to the northwest in the southern part of present-day Switzerland. But no glassblowing in Venice per se. We have to wait until the 9th and 10th centuries when glass working first appears on the island of Torcello. And in the late 13th century, we know that glassblowing was going on in Murano, this little island just to the north of Venice, because by that time glassblowers had been organized into a guild, and in 1291 the glass factories in Venice, main Venice, were moved to Murano, supposedly to isolate the workers, to better keep the secrets of glassworking secret, and also to prevent the risk of fires in Venice. You know, at that time, the buildings were all wood. The stone buildings we see today are from later. The first objects to be widely circulated and popular throughout Europe were vessels like this. This is the so-called Aldrevendine beaker in the British Museum. There's a frieze there that says, Magister Aldrevendine made me. And the characteristic of these is that they're thinly blown, some of the glass is extremely clear, and they're enameled on both sides. So there's enameling on the inside behind the shield and a lot of enameling on the outside. And these were made in the late 13th, early 14th centuries. And we know they were popular because the finds are all over Europe, and there are considerable numbers. I mean, just in Germany alone, there are 113, 5 in Russia. You see the distribution is really impressive, even Portugal, far away. So these were widely circulated. They were made in Venice, decorated in Venice. And later, around 1500, begins what many of us call the golden age of Venetian glass. And it starts with these gilded and enameled vessels. You see the gilding, the enameling on top of the vessels, and it was actually a very tricky process, not so much to put the gold on and to paint the enamel, but to fire the enamels is a very advanced, difficult process. So technically it was a real cutting-edge technology. From a bit later, we have these incredibly beautiful glasses that are like line drawings. They're minimalist in a way. They're very elegant, very thin. They're extremely difficult to make because the glass is so thin and it cools so quickly. From a bit later, sometime in the 17th century, We have the, and I just wanted to mention, those are the kind of glasses you see in Titian's Tintorettos and Veronese's. These very elegant, simple shapes. And in a moment, I'm going to show you the process for those. A little bit later, sometime in the 17th century, mid to late 17th century is my guess, a more advanced process was invented, developed, whereby objects could be made in parts and then assembled hot. It's all done with the vessel very hot. And this allowed for greater complexity. But let's go back to around 1575, 1600, 1625, when this sort of thing was popular. They were popular all over Europe. They were made by enormously skilled glassblowers. And this is the process, much condensed. One of those glasses takes about 10 or 11 minutes to make. It begins with blowing the vessel body, the cup. The end is trimmed. Here's the much later invention. This constriction is the thing that will allow me to break it off the blowpipe. This is, I believe, a medieval invention. There's a bit of glass that's tooled to become a disc, simply a decorative disc, and it's on this that the stem will sit. Here's a second bubble of glass that will become the stem. The stem is tooled to have some shape, some interesting variations of diameter. Here's another, after trimming the tip, here's another little bit of glass for another disc, and it's on this that the foot will sit. You see, it's a continuous additive process. The cup, the maurice, the stem, the maurice, and now the foot. And this bubble will have its end opened to become the foot. There's a lot cut out here so that you can get the overall picture, the big picture of the process. Here's the attachment of the punty or pontil. And with this constriction, I simply hold it and tap, and it breaks very cleanly. Again, that's a much later invention as a technique for separating the vessel from the blowpipe. And now, with reheats between, the soffietta or puffer is used to inflate the glass, and it's reheated, and that's done again. The goal here is to make a very nice exponential flare on the cup. And it's reheated, tooled, until the profile is just right. And if you're wondering how these are separated from the punty, it's done simply with a little tap. It breaks rather cleanly, and it leaves the characteristic punty mark. And that's the process I call building a goblet on the blowpipe. It's a continuous process of adding elements. This is the slightly more complicated process that allows for more complexity. So we have these from the late 17th, maybe the early 18th century, an owl goblet, a hunchback goblet. These are both in the British Museum. This is in the Corning Museum of Glass, and I'm going to show you a video, a much compressed video of this process. This is one in the British Museum, and these two are in the Corning Museum of Glass. These dragon stem goblets were popular in the later 17th and I think the early 18th century. They're often dated much earlier, but I'm very not convinced that's so. At any rate, what we're going to see is the making of a replica of this. I've made the foot off camera. It's being put on hold in a kiln that is idling at about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. There's the cup. And the dragon. I've attached the foot to a punty, and here's the first little, what we call glue bit. Studio glass people call this a glue bit. It's just a little bit of hot glass used to stick the parts together. There's the dragon. This all has to be kept well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's the second glue bit. Here's the cup. The glue bit hardens in about 7 or 8 seconds, so there's very little time to do this procedure. And again, everything is heated to about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit before it's broken off the punty and placed in the special oven for slow cooling. And this is a process I call building an object from prefabricated parts, attaching them with glue bits. That's kind of a bulky name, but two different processes. One a very continuous process and the other with interruptions and allowing for much greater complexity. And this is the other high point. In my title, I mentioned that 4th century in Cologne is the high point of Roman glass working virtuosity. And here we are in Venice around 1709. 1709 isn't around, it's 1709. I'll tell you about that in a second. But this goblet stands, I put a ruler next to it. It's over 1 meter tall. The parts are added, the 3 parts, the cup, the stem, the foot, are stuck together with these glue bits. And so the glassblower had on the end of a metal rod this thing that was 2 feet tall in a wood-fired furnace. It's a degree of skill that no one today can come close to. So it's an amazing feat. Now the reason the date, it's sort of a silly date, 1709, unless you understand that the King of Denmark made a visit to Venice in 1708, 1709, and he was given a state gift of 200 pieces of the finest Venetian glass. And fortunately for us, he had them sent back to the castle Rosenborg in Copenhagen, where they sit today. You can visit and see the glass room just off the throne room and see some of the most amazing glass vessels made. And this is a video that for some reason is misbehaving, but it's the most complicated of them all. And it's neat in a video that you can get a better idea. Dolphins. The cup and the lid are made of reticello glass, the most difficult decorative technique. Sorry it's bumping like that, but it's almost worth it. The flowers are made by flame working. There are peacock heads. And all the while, the reticello is just begging to crack. It's very difficult to not have reticello crack. So, in the end, 2 great high points in glassmaking. Cologne around sometime in the 4th century, glass working techniques that nobody can do today. It's really way beyond the skill of anyone. And in Venice, around 1700, just for a comfortable date. A degree of virtuosity that, again, has never been approached. Never in the 19th century could anyone do anything this complicated. And in the 19th century, the Venetians were trying. And here's another variation, reticello, with all of these added parts. Again, made at a wood-fired furnace. It's really quite beyond my imagination to be able to conceive of making these things at a wood-fired furnace. Are there any questions?
Yeah, could you clarify? I think you said the 15th century was the golden age of Venetian glass.
It's about a 250-year period. It begins around 1500, 1480s and 90s, and it peters out in the early 18th century, let's say 1725, 1750. And it's during that time that Venice provided the luxury glass for the wealthy and powerful, the aristocratic, the royal, all over Europe. So if you were the king and queen of Sweden, you had Venetian glass on your table in that period. If you were the queen of England, you brought a glassblower from Venice to make Venetian glass to London. It was the golden age because they were the sole suppliers of fine glass. And in the early 18th century, other countries began making very fine luxury glass and began to erode the Venetian market. And with the erosion of the Venetian market, the skills began to diminish, the quality of the designs, the quality of the workers' techniques diminished. And by the middle of the century, by 1750 or so, just a real rough date, the skills were very much in decline. And the industry basically shut down by the beginning of the 19th century. In fact, in 1807, Napoleon closed the factories. And glassmaking didn't really get back on its feet in Venice until the 40s, the 1840s, 1850s, and it was firmly established back on the international scene as a force in glassmaking by about 1860, 1870. So there was about a 100-year hiatus when Venice wasn't making luxury glass. Anyway, that's what we call the golden age of Venetian glass. And the glass made in the 19th century is often called revival glass. And the period between is often called the period of crisis. Okay.
Is there any reason to know how the Venetians invented glassmaking? There was nowhere near mechanics that actually had that tradition.
Well, of course they were famous for trade, and we have to assume that a lot of these techniques came from trade. For example, the enameling and gilding around 1500, we're not quite sure whether that came from the Islamic world or possibly had come from the Byzantine world. We don't know how it got to Venice, that particular technology, because both could easily have come. Maybe it was a combination of the two. But the glassworking and the different techniques undoubtedly came from trade, I think. Of course, it's the most unlikely place on the planet to make glass, to work glass, because everything is imported. The wood is imported. The raw materials are imported. Then everything has to be exported. It's a very, very awkward place, but obviously succeeded. Yes, please.
I noticed some square shapes among the Roman vases. How did they get their square shapes by blowing?
Yeah, it was a process of mold blowing. Mold blowing begins in maybe the teens, 10 AD, 20 AD, 30 AD, something like that. We have mold blowing beginning. And some of the molds were very simple, stone boxes basically, into which the bubble was lowered and inflated. And so what you saw, I showed you a handle on a square bottle. That's a very, very simple mold. And we do have surviving pieces of those molds, and they're made of stone. From sometime like 10 or 20 AD, we have someone cleverly coming up with the idea that just as you can make oil lamps of terracotta by pressing them in terracotta molds, you can lower a bubble into a terracotta mold, 2 or 3 or 4 part mold, inflate the glass, open the mold, and instantly have a decorated, completed vessel. That's full-size mold blowing. And those are early first century, those technologies. They really get going sometime in the middle or later first century. So.
How did they control the temperature of wood fire?
Well, that's an interesting question. How do they control the temperature of wood-fired furnaces? Almost every September, for 10 or so years now, I go to a wood-fired furnace in Belgium and work with people who are mostly interested in Roman glass blowing. And the interesting thing is, it's easy to control the temperature of the furnace, the melting furnace. You can see when it's glowing at about the temperature you saw in these videos. Oh no, those are wood-fired. These are gas-fired. Mine are gas-fired, yeah, methane and forced air. And wood furnaces are easy to manage in that it's obvious when it's too hot, it's too bright, when it's too cool, it's too dark, too dim. But what I haven't mentioned is that at the end of all of these hot processes, the glass has to be cooled slowly. For a thin, small vessel, it might be an hour or two. For the blank for the Portland vase, it may be a couple of days. In that oven, the temperature has to go from around 1,000 Fahrenheit to around 700 degrees Fahrenheit in a very gradual, controlled way, or the piece will break. And that's called annealing. And the interesting thing working at wood-fired appliances is that the furnace is easy, the annealing oven is very difficult, in that the annealing oven looks exactly the same at room temperature as it does at annealing temperature, which is about 1,000 Fahrenheit. There's no difference visually. So that's very difficult to control. But we know they did because we have all of these objects that survive. They had no thermometer, no, it was all done by some empirical assessment measuring technique. When I first started going to Venice in the early 80s, I saw a furnace that had an annealing oven. It was basically just a big box of bricks, at one end of which there was a big yellow gassy flame. And the guy who was in charge of it had a stack of newspaper, and he would take a piece of newspaper, ball it up, and throw it into the annealer and count. And if it burst into flame in about 3 seconds, that meant that was the right temperature right there. It was very interesting to see. Very interesting. Well, I think we've arrived at the end.
I think what we should do, I mean, hopefully at the end of this, you must tell us where we can buy Bill Gudenrath glass. We've had the most extraordinary lecture. I mean, not only have we got somebody who can tell us how things were done that needed to be worked out, we've also got somebody who can tell us just how unbelievably difficult some of the things we're looking at is, but he's also done most of it in front of our eyes. It's the most extraordinary privilege to have seen this lecture and to listen to you, Bill.
Thank you, Chris.
Unfortunately, I now need to invite everybody to come and have a drink from a plastic cup. But nevertheless, whilst you're quaffing up Prosecco, just imagine you're drinking from one of those Roman or Venetian replicas. And before that, let us thank you most warmly for this wonderful lecture, a really fitting tribute to David, but also a wonderful tribute to the art of the glassmaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.